We live in a country of two narratives. We have ideals of justice and the rule of law, respect for human dignity, woven throughout our Constitution, our great documents, and our history. But we also have a historical narrative of torture and disregard for the humanity of others, beginning with our violence and exploitation of Native Americans, the enslavement, segregation, Jim Crow laws, and lynching of Black Americans, the internment of Japanese Americans. Today, the reality of our acts at Guantanamo and in CIA secret prisons embrace our nation's worst self. Our leaders today have disregarded laws in order to get around prohibitions against torture that we have honored in our military, our domestic systems, and our legal system for decades. We, as citizens of the United States, and as citizens of allies who have been complicit with the United States, are responsible for allowing it to continue. This is not just a problem of the Bush administration. It is a problem that we are responsible for as well. We learned early in 2004 that the United States was engaging in torture and abuse of individuals detained at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. We learned that people in Guantanamo were being tortured. And yet the Bush administration took power again and reigned for 4 more years. We did not hold the Democratic Party accountable for their complicity in allowing laws to be passed, for Democratic leadership on intelligence committees to allowing and not exercising oversight over CIA waterboarding practices. These things we, as individuals who hold power as citizens, allowed to happen. So today we are going to address, the speakers and individuals you'll hear today are going to talk about what we can do now, what actions we can take to strive towards justice. It is our collective and individual responsibility. CCR's clients remain in Guantanamo today. My colleagues, 2 of my colleagues, 3 of them actually are in Guantanamo this week, meeting with our clients who remain behind razor wire or remain in isolation units, blank walls, and are in their isolation units for hours and hours on end without normal human contact. Most of you should know that there was another suicide this week at Guantanamo. My colleagues, after spending all day sitting in cage cells with our clients, shackled during their meetings with their attorneys, returned after an 1.5 hour long journey from the prison across the bays onto a ferry to the hotel where they stay, came back to emails notifying them that while they were at the prison, the death had occurred. They then had to prepare that evening for the next set of visits the following day, knowing that they would be walking into an environment with traumatized individuals wanting to know what happened, knowing that something had gone on, but not having information about who died, how'd they die, what's going to happen to their body. That's happening today at this moment in Guantanamo. We can't participate in the voyeurism of torture anymore. These powerful images that you sat here and watched for a while, the information that you're going to learn it's no longer enough to be a mental couch potato about these things. So I'm going to take one of my precious 10 minutes to give you an opportunity to reflect if you are ready to act. Because I cannot share with you the description of my client's torture, Mohammed Al Qahtani. I cannot give you the privilege of his experience without knowing that you will take the responsibility for what you've learned. It has been too long, and we are powerful citizens of a powerful country. So I've got my watch, and I'm going to give you a minute to think. And if you're not prepared to take one of the steps, and I'm going to give you 5 easy suggestions, so you don't even have to be creative about it. If you're not ready, I'd invite you to go out into the hall for a moment and look at some of the literature while I speak, and when I'm done speaking, I'd invite you to come in and listen to the rest of the speakers. But my client is still there, and he has been tortured, and we need individuals to act now. So here's 5 quick suggestions. You can call or write your elected officials to demand prosecution. You can write a letter to an editor, preferably outside of New York City. Think about alumni magazines, hometown papers, professional journals. Talk to your family about these issues. 4th of July may be a perfect weekend to do so. You can educate yourself before those family conversations, going to the center's website and learning basic facts about Guantanamo or about torture or about preventive detention. Visit a legislator. That may be a little bit more active. And here's the most passive one: simply donate to one of the organizations that you know are working to obtain prosecutions for government officials who engaged in torture or to get accountability and justice for the individual victims. And I'm sure you can think of other actions to take on your own. So I'm going to give you a moment to either take a break and look at some literature or to make that commitment to take action now. I've been working with Mohammed Al Qahtani for over 3.5 years. He's a young Saudi national who was captured while crossing the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, along with hundreds and thousands of people. And he was brought to Guantanamo in February 2002. He was identified, we went through the same kinds of interrogations and descriptions you've, I'm sure, heard of many individuals in Guantanamo. But in August 2002, he came to the attention of the FBI and military authorities because he had tried to enter the Orlando International Airport shortly before September 11th and brought suspicions to the United States government that he may have been a potential 20th hijacker. As a result of that, he became the focus of a great deal of interrogation and attention. He was placed into 3 months of isolation from August 2002 until October 2002. He was held in a small box-like, not small box, but in a cell that was just simply a box. There was nothing in it. He was given very minimal human contact. When he was interacted with by guards or the MPs, they often were covered and masked, and he was interrogated frequently. This was a period of time when he was also threatened with military working dogs, which are terrifying to him. He experienced sleep deprivation. And at the end of this 3 months, an FBI deputy director stationed at Guantanamo, T.J. Harrington, wrote a letter to his superiors describing his concern that the abuse of individuals by the military was occurring at Guantanamo. And he described Mr. Al Qahtani as exhibiting extreme psychological trauma from what happened to him, remaining in a fetal position, covered in his blankets, and seeming psychotic. At the end of that 3-month period, Mr. Al Qahtani was subjected to what's become known as the first special interrogation plan. And this is the very famous memo that Secretary Rumsfeld issued, where he authorized enhanced, quote, enhanced interrogation techniques and signed at the bottom, "I stand 8 hours a day. Why limit forcible standing to 4 hours?" Those interrogation tactics in that plan was implemented on Mr. Al Qahtani. It involved 20-hour-long interrogations that resulted in sleep deprivation. This lasted for around 50 days, where he was only permitted to sleep between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m. For that entire period of time. Now, I certainly, in our work these days at the center, have pulled all-nighters, and that's getting more and more difficult the older I get. And remember, painfully, the day after I pulled an all-nighter, the kind of headaches and dizziness and fuzziness that I experience. And it is incomprehensible to me, as a human and as a lawyer, what it would be like to go through that for as many days as Mr. Al Qahtani did. And it is only when he is released or when he is able to speak to you directly that we will have a better understanding of what he experienced. These 20-hour interrogations were combined with medical monitoring. They cleared him for torture. The doctors were involved in giving him IVs and overhydrating him. He would then be strapped down and not allowed to use the restroom, would use the restroom on himself and then be unable to pray. So the doctors were heavily involved in his interrogation. He was also given an enema, stripped down and given an enema in front of male and female interrogators. He was subjected to sensory overstimulation, where music was played while he was bound and shackled and sleep deprived and dehydrated or overhydrated. He went through a variety of sexual and religious humiliations, many of which descriptions have been put out on the internet, either through his own description or through documents from the Freedom of Information Act that have been released. At one point during this interrogation, his heart rate dropped so low that he was rushed to the hospital because they were afraid he was going to die. This is an individual at Guantanamo in the custody of the United States military. A cardiologist was flown in from Puerto Rico to confirm he was going to survive, and in the next day, that was the only evening during this time where he slept for more than 4 hours. And on his way back to his cell, he was interrogated. At the end of this period of time, he, from all indications, he was then held in isolation and was moved eventually to a maximum security facility at Guantanamo, which is how he was when I first met him. When I first met him with our interpreter, he was just crunched in the corner. Our interpreter kept having to ask him to remove his hands from his face so that he could understand what he was saying, and he was a very irrational individual who had a difficult time having a coherent conversation and following a chain of thought for more than 10 or 15 minutes. It has taken a great deal of work to be able to gain his trust and to get to any kind of semi-functional working relationship with him. The convening authority of the military commissions earlier this year acknowledged that Mr. Al Qahtani's treatment met the legal definition of torture. This is the first time a sitting government official has acknowledged that the United States engaged in torture. We are currently, in his case in the United States, fighting the government's attempt to use evidence obtained through torture to justify his ongoing detention. And you're going to hear from a number of speakers the risk that the use of torture and our decision not to prosecute at this point, how that has tainted judicial proceedings and how that creates a risk, not just for the individuals at Guantanamo, but what we say is okay. When we say that waterboarding or sleep deprivation or temperature extremes are okay for people in our custody, we're telling the world that it's okay for American troops. And that's something that needs to be taken into account, not just for the individuals in Guantanamo, but for the individuals who are out there in the world on behalf of the United States. I'll leave you with one thought. The death this week at Guantanamo has brought all of us who have been working at the base, has reminded us that this is not the first death. It will likely not be the last. If we engage in preventive detention, new laws, radically new legal regimes that allow for ongoing indefinite detention, if we continue to leave the fate of these individuals unknown, if they do not get treatment, if they are not moved from a system like Guantanamo, they're just simply brought from Guantanamo to a different physical location, we will see more suicides. The human spirit and the human body cannot endure year after year after year of this kind of treatment. I caught my breath when I stepped into this room and saw the individuals standing in orange jumpsuits with the black hoods and saw the images of violence, of torture the United States has engaged in. And I'm grateful that I'm not numb to that. I'm grateful that I walk into the room, I pause, and I remember that behind each of those masks is a face and a family, and that behind each of those images of torture are victims, not just the individual who died and not just his family, but the soldiers who were not given directions, the individuals who were placed in a position where they weren't given proper supervision. For those of you that have seen Taxi to the Dark Side, you know that the trauma goes in many directions. These images and words are about people, they're about us, about our country, about the world our children will live in. The time has long passed for us to take action. Thank you.
Thank you, Gitanjali, and thank you to World Can't Wait for fulfilling that function of appearing tonight in the jumpsuits. I want you all to adhere to the pledge you made in standing up. Our next speaker is Jeremy Scahill, who's an investigative reporter. And as you can see, and as many of you know, he wrote Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. And what's not in your program is rebelreports.com is his website, and I recommend that you go there every morning and you'll find something new and that you need to know. Jeremy Scahill.
I find it incredibly humbling to listen to attorneys who've been the real freedom fighters in this society during this incredibly dark period in our history. People like Gita and Michael and their colleagues, those that are at Guantanamo right now, and people like Clive Stafford Smith, the incredibly heroic lawyer, their jobs in this society, the work that they're doing right now, would be largely unnecessary if we had an actual opposition party in this country. If we had an actual movement that had a spine and was not itself complicit in the torture, funding it, voting for it, staying silent when they know that it's happening. Nancy Pelosi can fumble for that statement that some aide wrote for her all she wants, but the fact is that she and other leaders of the Democratic Party knew damn well that this torture was happening, and they either were mute in the face of this overwhelming evidence. They could have picked up the phone and called any number of those attorneys who win a lot of mainstream civil liberties organizations. Wouldn't do it. We're actually taking the personal risk of defending those people that were being described by officials in Washington as the most heinous individuals who'd ever walked planet Earth. We wouldn't need people like Michael and Gita to be fighting these battles if those whose responsibility it is to prevent those kinds of actions from taking place actually were doing their jobs. So I want to say that at the onset, because as we discuss the specific cases of torture, as Gita just did and as Michael will later, and as we talk about the failure on the part of the Obama administration thus far to hold any of the criminals who thought up these programs, who gave the orders to implement the torture, and those who did the torture themselves, not a single one of these individuals has faced any form of justice whatsoever for the crimes that they've committed in the names of every person in this country. The fact is that people act gobsmacked, they act shocked that this is happening right now, stunned that there's an escalation of the war in Afghanistan. Obama's disappointing us. I get that email every day, oh, Obama was the great disappointment. Obama telegraphed his passes the entire time he was running for office. Let me break down a few things that are happening in the world right now. In Iraq, we have a slightly downsized occupation that has been rebranded by the Obama administration. We have an escalation of the war in Afghanistan, where there could potentially be 78,000 US troops by next year. You have a man who's just been named the commander of operations in Afghanistan, who not only was one of the central people in covering up the killing of Pat Tillman by other US soldiers and making it look like he was killed in an insurgent attack, but this individual, McChrystal, also was one of the leaders of the teams in Iraq that were hunting down so-called insurgents and partaking in extrajudicial executions of these individuals with no trial, no due process whatsoever, and then running secret prisons in contravention of the Geneva Convention and not allowing the Red Cross to visit prisoners. That's the man Obama has chosen now to run operations in Afghanistan. They have that abomination of a US embassy in Baghdad that recently opened that was built on slave labor and is bigger than any embassy in the history of the world. 500 CIA operatives alone operating out of it. It's the size of Vatican City. The Vatican, of course, has embassies in other countries. We have an embassy the size of the Vatican in Iraq right now. The US just announced plans to build a massive colonial-type fortress in Islamabad, Pakistan, that's going to be one of the hubs of US operations for a long time. But don't mention the word occupation in conjunction with Afghanistan. We're just there for US national security. Well, the fact is that Obama campaigned on a lot of things that involved fierce rhetoric. But he also campaigned pretty honestly about what he was going to do in the world. And that, I think, is the challenge for all of us, is to actually own up to the fact that we could have seen the writing on the wall when it was there, coming out of the mouth of the man that was running on this campaign of change. He said he was going to do all of these things. I recently had obtained documents from the Pentagon that show that in Iraq, there's a 23% increase in the first quarter of 2009 in the number of armed mercenaries that are operating in Iraq. Now, the Pentagon says that's because they're doing better accounting right now. They can count them. Obama didn't continue Blackwater's contract, but instead hired another company called Triple Canopy, which has a notoriously atrocious human rights record, and then a bunch of the Blackwater guys were just rehired by Triple Canopy. So there you have the change we can believe in Iraq. In Afghanistan, 29% increase in the number of armed U.S. mercenaries working for for-profit corporations benefiting off of bloodshed and violence. In Afghanistan, they're very explicit about it. They say that it's consistent with the troop buildup there. At present, there are 250,000 contractors operating in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. That constitutes half of the entire force that CENTCOM has fighting those two occupation wars. Half of them are working for for-profit corporations. When it comes to Guantanamo, one of the things that I'm sure it's only because Gita ran out of time that she wasn't able to really highlight, and I know she talks about this a lot, the torture's ongoing at Guantanamo. It's not like, Dick Cheney ordered waterboarding and all the Democrats just were shocked that it happened, and then now it doesn't happen anymore because Obama issued that edict after his inauguration. Here's a fact that is undeniable. Torture is happening right now at Guantanamo. Torture is happening right now at Guantanamo. And one of the reasons why it's happening is because there has been a systematic failure and refusal to hold the torturers accountable. They have nothing to lose by continuing to brutalize these prisoners. I recently did a story for Alternet that has gotten absolutely no attention in the corporate press, where I looked in depth into the operations of these teams that operate at Guantanamo called the Immediate Reaction Force. The prisoners and their lawyers call them the Extreme Repression Force. This is not the interrogators. These are not the guys doing the waterboarding. This is a force whose entire role at Guantanamo is to terrorize prisoners who resist in the slightest bit anything that they're told by anyone in authority there. You take an extra styrofoam cup because you want to write a poem on it. They call in these 5-man thug squads dressed in what Clive Stafford Smith calls Darth Vader outfits. They're each assigned, the 5 of them, each assigned a body part of the prisoner, the head, the left arm, the left leg, the right leg. They douse them with a chemical agent. They go in. The first guy in with the shield slams the guy to the ground. They take them, they hog-tie them, and sometimes leave them hog-tied like that. If it's not good enough to brutalize them in that fashion, they also do things like placing their heads in toilets and repeatedly flushing the toilet. They take the feces from one prisoner and smear it in the face of another. One guard, after Obama's inauguration, urinated on the head of one of the prisoners represented by the Center for Constitutional Rights. This is happening not under Commander-in-Chief George Bush, but it's happening under Commander-in-Chief Barack Obama. And while he issued that executive order on the 22nd or 23rd of January saying that the United States was going to close Guantanamo and that it was going to respect the Geneva Conventions, every day there's a violation of the Geneva Conventions because they are abusing prisoners. They are being punitive against them with physical violence for nonviolent offenses on the part of the prisoners. These teams that are torturing people at Guantanamo, sticking hoses up to their nose and turning it on at full blast, ramming tubes to force-feed prisoners on a hunger strike down into their stomach, yanking them out with no anesthetic, and then reinserting them into the nose of another prisoner without taking any time to even clean it off. One prisoner said in the CCR report, that's torture, torture, torture. Just being force-fed itself is an act of torture at Guantanamo. These are not the teams that did the waterboarding. These were not the guys who were sitting there with the contractors and others trying to think of a new sadistic way to mangle this human being's insides or outsides. These are pure and simple thug squads. Michael Ratner, when I interviewed him for this story, said they're the black shirts of Guantanamo. And he didn't say that in December of 2008. He said that 2 weeks ago, talking about a force that continues to operate there. So we have all of this information, and I'm glad that Gita did something that probably made some people uncomfortable, because the fact is an event like this, especially with attorneys on the front lines of this struggle, should be jam-packed. There should be a line circling around the block. But you know what's happened in this society is that I get email all the time from people telling me to shut up, give it up, move on, it's over, give the guy a chance. You don't give a guy a chance who's allowing torture to continue, not as a journalist and not as a responsible citizen in this society. You don't give power to continue abusing people in your name. And so while there may be only a few people in this crowd, And we know there are a lot of people on the outside that maybe in good faith think, well, Obama's going to change everything, and we elected him, so our work is done. I'm fond of saying this, and I feel like I say it all the time, but it's so true. Kathy Kelly, the great human rights activist who right now is in Pakistan, risking her life under the threat of drone bombardments by the United States, said that you can't be anti-war between Republican administrations any more than you can be a vegetarian between meals. In other words, you need to stand up even when that guy you like, if you like him, happens to be the President of the United States, especially when those individuals are in power. And so, in closing, what I want to say is I recently read an article in a neocon Zionist publication of JINSA, which is one of the leading neocon organizations, written by a retired colonel named Ralph Peters. And in this article, he was calling for the United States in future wars to attack militarily what he called partisan media. He literally meant to bomb journalists who were combatants because they were reporting facts that were inconvenient to the U.S. propaganda machine. And it's there for you to read. You can see it. He laid this out explicitly. Well, first of all, the United States has been attacking journalists for a very long time. Al Jazeera's offices were bombed in Afghanistan in 2001, as were the BBC's. Tariq Ayoub, the Al Jazeera correspondent, was killed by U.S. warplanes as he reported on the battle for Baghdad in April of 2003. The Sheraton Hotel in Basra was bombed when Al Jazeera were the only guests staying there. The Palestine Hotel was bombed, killing Jose Cuso, the Spanish cameraman, and one of his Ukrainian colleagues from Reuters. The United States has killed over a dozen journalists that we know of in Iraq. Over 120 media workers in all have been killed in that war. The United States bombed Radio Television Serbia under Bill Clinton in 1999, killing 16 journalists. The reason I'm bringing this up at the end is to answer the challenge that Gita put forward at the beginning. Those people who felt like they had a spine under Bush, who were standing up to those crimes under Bush, there's a simple challenge for you. Be the exact same person you were then. Be it then when there's only 5 people in a crowd instead of the 500 that would show up when it was in vogue or popular to wear an Arrest Bush t-shirt. Now, and I mean that in the greatest sense of the terms to Lori, who's been out there for a very long time with all the spine in the world. But the fact is that these crimes are ongoing, and we have journalists now who are acting as sort of blue state Fox, where all of a sudden they were critical at the end of Bush, and now it's Obama, so we got to lay off the guy, let him do his thing. No, his thing looks a lot like Bush's thing. And so we all have to pledge to be the same resistors that we were when it was popular to be so. That's when your conscience actually shines through. And until we realize that all of this is the product of false faith in a one-party system, we're never going to get anywhere in this country. Thank you.
Shaka Abdul Rahim Amir is a Saudi Arabian citizen and a British resident who has been detained at Guantanamo Bay since early 2002. The U.S. military alleges that he has ties to Al Qaeda, apparently because of his work in Afghanistan for Saudi charity, the El Haramein Foundation. A leader among the Guantanamo detainees, he elicited a concession from the military that it would allow the detainees to form a grievance committee and treat them in a manner consistent with the Geneva Convention. In September 2005, just days after the grievance committee was formed, the military disbanded it and sent Amir to solitary confinement where he remains today. They Fight for Peace by Shakir Abdurrahim Amir. Peace, they say. Peace if mind, peace on earth, peace of what kind? I see them talking, arguing, fighting. What kind of peace are they looking for? Why do they kill? What are they planning? Is it just talk? Why do they argue? Is it so simple to kill? Is this their plan? Yes, of course. They talk, they argue, they kill. They fight for peace.
that you can get to Grit TV on the internet, and her writing has appeared in The Nation, in these times, in The Progressive. Laura Flanders.
Because Jeremy, and thank you for the introduction, everybody, because Jeremy talked about the power of media, I want you to be sure to know where to get some alternative views and coverage from, right? So I'm going to put this very important sign on the front here so that you will be aware that Grit TV exists, and we're not only online, although you can get us whenever you want. Isn't that fun? You can get us in the morning, you can get us in the evening, whenever you want. It is on your demand. There are some things you can get free on demand, and Grit TV is one of them. You can get Grit TV anytime you want at grittv.org. You got a pencil? grittv.org. You can also watch it in Manhattan on Channel 67 every night at 8, right after Democracy Now! And we're getting to cable stations and public television stations all over the country, so tell your friends. I'm going to talk about the power of the media because I am fed up by the media coverage that we are getting of this moment. I want to take you back 1 week. Was it only 1 week when you had the dueling national security speeches? Do you remember that? And Barack Obama, Jeremy is completely right. People want to believe in Barack Obama. I did a whole book in 2006. It came out in 2007 called Blue Grit. And it was about a rising tide of progressive folks who realized the Democratic Party sucked and they had to do something about it. And a lot of them looked at the options and they said, well, you know what? We're just going to bite the bullet and we're going to get involved in electoral politics one way or another. And they ran for local office and they did local action and they were effective in helping to change things at the local level where they live. It had an effect on the 2006 congressional races. And when it came to 2008, the reason that Barack Obama won and Hillary Clinton didn't win the nomination, it was because he understood what was there to be tapped into. Did he create a progressive movement? No, a progressive movement created him. And they wanted better than this. So when I think about what Jeremy said about the importance and the urgency of a radical critique right now, it's because I'm thinking of those people who put their hopes and their dreams into this guy and the possibility of change. Were they stupid to do that? No, our media tells us that's what politics is. You pick one guy once every 4 years, and it's almost always a guy, and you give them your vote, and then you go home. Right? So I don't blame people for thinking it's all about that guy. I do work every day at Grit TV to remind them that it's actually about we, the people. But so people want to believe in Barack Obama, right? They want to believe because they want life to change in their lives and in their communities. It's not just about changing personnel in the White House, it's about changing their reality where they live. And they listen to the speech that Barack Obama gave a week ago, and they heard some great stuff. The trouble is they heard a lot of contradictory stuff. He says one thing and he does another, but in fact he says both things. In that one speech, he lifted up America's timeless ideals, right? He also called for timeless detention. You can't do both. He paid homage to the rule of law, but he said we may still need some special tribunals. You can't do both. He said we're going to reclaim the Constitution, but he's still talking about juries for some and not for others, and judges for some and not for the rest. He's still not pushing for a special prosecutor. He's saying, well, wait and see. You can't have the Constitution and special courts for some. They had that in colonial England. The Constitution was supposed to get rid of all that stuff. That's why a lot of people like me went from there to here. You can't have special treatment and special courts and equality for all. All people created equal. And Barack Obama said the problem, one of his most powerful lines was the problem of Guantanamo is not the closing of Guantanamo, because that's the problem that's been problematized in the media. He said it's not the closing of Guantanamo, it was the opening of Guantanamo. And of course, on one level, he's right. But it's a cop-out because the problem is also the closing of Guantanamo. If it doesn't also mean the closing of all the other black sites, so-called, and why are they always called black when they're supposed to be bad? The closing of all those other black sites all across the world. The conversation we need to be having is about the problems in Barack Obama's plan. But I went on MSNBC last week to talk about this very thing, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, and there's no room to talk about the problems of Barack Obama's plan, because we have to talk about Dick Cheney. And where were all the speeches of Al Gore broadcast live when he was the former vice president? Why are we listening to Dick Cheney? And why is MSNBC and CNN all giving him live airtime for his speeches? And why is he making them? We're feeding into it every time we allow the discussion to be between Barack Obama and Dick Cheney. But where do we go for the rest? Dick Cheney gets away with talking about having kept us safe. Who's the us, Dick? Not us people in Afghanistan, not us people in Palestine, not us people in Iraq. And I said last week, because it was the week before, or 2 weeks ago, the week before Memorial Day, I said, kept us safe? Tell that to the mourning families on Memorial Day. Didn't keep them safe. And this week I would say, tell that to the people of Wichita, Kansas. I went back and looked. We've had a Department of Homeland Security, right? Homeland, don't you feel better? We've had a Department of Homeland Security, bigger and bigger, more and more money. What was the FBI's #1 domestic terror threat this time last year? And it had been for years. Anybody know? Eco-terrorism. And when Barack Obama put together a report, the Department of Homeland Security put out a report on domestic terror threats, and it actually went so far as to include people like those who killed Dr. George Tiller, and that guy did not act alone. When they put groups like that and white supremacist groups like the Freemen and the Aryan Nation, all the rest in that list, well, believe it or not, surprise, surprise, they got flack from right-wing crazy people. His trouble is all those right-wing crazy people are on television every night. So what did the Barack Obama administration do? Back away from their report. How do they look now? Stupid. So I want to go back to the beginning tableau that we saw. And I'm not a member of the RCP, I'm not a member of World Can't Wait, but I thank you for doing what you do. It's ridiculous that this is the size of this group. And I've been moved every time I've seen those people at demonstrations all across this country for the last however many years it is, it's too many years. So I want to thank you for being everywhere you have been and being here tonight. And I want us to think about those hooded men and women. We can't allow ourselves to be hooded. We cannot decide that it is easier to just put on the hood. And we can't allow our friends to do it either. Gita was absolutely right. July 4th is coming up, but don't wait till July 4th. There are a lot of people out there who just don't want to talk about this stuff anymore. And I am afraid it is up to you to be the communicator. For all the hoods, it's up to you to communicate. It's up to you to ask the questions. It's up to you to carry the stories. You may love Keith Olbermann, you may love Rachel Maddow, but they're not going to do it for you. Honestly, they're not. And as easily as they brought us some slightly more progressive programming on MSNBC, so they can also take it away. We have to make our own media. We have to develop our own megaphones. We have to connect with each other, leverage our support where we have it, which is laterally, not vertically. Connect with each other, support media that you care about. Don't be hooded. Speak up. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Jeremy. Our next speaker is a great honor to have her here. It's Sister Diana Ortiz, and as you read in your program, she was abducted in 1989 by right-wing death squads in Guatemala, and she was brutally tortured. She will probably tell you some of that story. I want to point out that she's the founder and director for 10 years of Torture, Abolition, and Survivors Support Committee International, TASC. This is a very important organization. You should check it out. Sister Diana Ortiz.
Thank you. I am here to share my reflections about the life experiences of torture survivors. And certainly one of the obvious experiences we have is that we quickly learn that for the public in general, we don't know anything worth knowing. I ask you to think back to the TV programs, talk shows, print media pieces on the subject, congressional briefings and hearings, and many conferences on the issues of torture, except this one. How many times has a survivor been called upon to offer his or her views on this subject? A subject we know from the inside out. Not many, I assure you. For those who are willing to listen to us, it should soon be obvious that torture leaves no part of a person's life untouched. What I will share with you tonight is drawn from my interactions with fellow survivors over the past decade and a half. While there is no one single model that encompasses all lived experiences of survivors, there are characteristics or effects that are quite common among us. We lived through something unspeakable. At the point of victimization, we began to die a slow death. We are stripped of our dignity, our sense of control, and our very link with humanity. Trust is gone. Hope is gone. Faith is gone. And security is gone. And we are prepared to say anything we think they want to hear so that they may more quickly kill us. In the words of one Honduran torturer, eventually they all begged to die. For those of us who do not die, what we have lost is replaced with alienation, a sense of betrayal, and a terrible fear. A metamorphosis takes place. Though technically alive, we feel more akin to the dead than to the living. People around us celebrate our survival while we mourn our own deaths. We are strangers to everyone, those closest to us, even to ourselves. We are no longer part of a world where once we felt at home. Listen for a moment to the words of the tortured Austrian philosopher Jean Amery. Anyone who has been tortured remains tortured. Anyone who has suffered torture never again will be at ease in the world. Faith in humanity, already cracked by the first slap in the face and then demolished by torture, is never acquired again. Many of us carry the physical scars of having been beaten, hanged by wrist, arms or legs, burned by electrical devices or cigarettes, cut or stabbed with knives and machetes. Then there are those with permanent head injuries, amputated limbs, and the like. Each mark, visible or invisible, is a lasting reminder of what was done to us. A reminder that often brings embarrassment and even shame. What a cruel irony it is. It is the tortured and not the torturer who feels shame. In 1997, as part of a National Institute of Mental Health working group on the mental health consequences of torture, I spoke with countless survivors. And I remember a young woman who, in addition to being subjected to waterboarding, had been raped daily by her torturers. They left marks on her body, symbolizing their pride of ownership. I lost contact with her, but I thought of her very often. And one day, not so long ago, I heard from her. She had dared to take a risk of letting a person into her life. He knew that she had been treated badly in her country, but he still loved me, she said, and we got married, she continued. Then the sobs came. On what was to be an important moment in their life together, her husband saw for the first time her breast. One of her torturers had bitten off her nipples. Another had branded his initials into her breast. When her husband saw her body, he left the room, never returning. While the physical act of torture may be assigned to the past, its psychological effects permeate the present and blight the promise of the future. So often, this is torture's intention. Torture is an attempt to obliterate a person's personality, to turn him or her into a quivering mass of fear, cowering in some corner of the world, afraid to look for the dawn. Torture does not end with the release from some clandestine prison, and it's not going to end for those who someday may be released from Guantanamo. It is not something we get over. It is forever, forever strapped to our backs. It constitutes a permanent invasion of our minds and our souls. Someone in uniform, a scream, the smell of a cigarette, perspiration, urine, whistling, heavy breathing, dripping water, clattering of keys, the sight of a dog, simply being in a cold, bright room, even making eye contact, being photographed, or a friendly embrace, any of them threaten to return us to that past which walks so closely behind us. Imagine for a moment what it's like to be shadowed by these images day in and day out. If one human being can do to another what has been done to us in those dark places, then for us, anyone is capable of anything, at any time, for any reason, or no reason at all. The only defense is to withdraw far into oneself. Trust no one. Look out at the world with guarded eyes. Imagine living that type of life. Survivors live it every single day. For many survivors, surviving torture is far worse than the actual physical torture itself. The wounds heal in time, but the memories cling to us. Please, please, don't believe what you hear from some of our leaders, pundits, and experts. The physical act of waterboarding is torture. Psychological effects last far beyond that physical act. Psychological torture is time without end. No one fully recovers from torture. The damage done can never be undone. A few moments ago, I spoke the words of Jean-Amaury. Faith is never restored. Some 20 years after his torture, he killed himself. I would be remiss if I did not mention something about the triumph of the human will. With all that survivors endure, there are those who insist that they will not yield to their torturers, and one such group is Task International. We exist to support each other in any way we can, to speak out to the world about what we know intimately, the effects of torture, not only on ourselves, but on our families, our communities, and the society itself. And importantly, we work to confront torture wherever it may occur, and demand that those who have ordered it be held accountable. And that includes members of the Bush administration, including the president himself. What do survivors have to say to those who have never been tortured? In the words of the Holocaust historian Yehuda Bauer, "Thou shalt not be a victim, thou shalt not be a perpetrator, and above all, thou shalt not be a bystander." Thank you.